Hello, and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie couch with Lucy Briers. Lucy is a British actress who's perhaps best known for her portrayal of Mary Bennet in the BAFTA and Emmy-winning BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. Following in the footsteps of her dad, TV actor Richard Briers, Lucy studied at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, graduating in 1991. She has appeared in over 40 plays across the UK and in the West End, including a one-woman show performed in London and New York, and 2 years with the Royal Shakespeare Company. Her recent screen work includes Justice League, Gentleman Jack, and Endeavour. Lucy Briers, welcome to the Marie Curie couch.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just recovering from a mild bout of COVID. I'm on day 12. So I went out for a walk yesterday.
First time out yesterday?
Yeah, first time out. It's a little bit like coming back from a really amazing holiday, although sadly it wasn't. And you kind of think the world's going to have changed. But of course, everything is exactly the same. So, so yeah, slightly surreal. But I was lucky that I didn't get it badly. So, you know, all good.
Good. And you're on the mend now?
Touch wood. Yeah. Going to take it easy though.
Lucy, can I start by asking if you can tell us about a significant bereavement you've experienced in your life?
Yes. It wasn't difficult to choose. I suppose it's very upsetting in a way to say that in the last 9 years, I've lost my father and 3 friends. So there was a part of me that thought perhaps I should talk about losing my friends rather than my father. But I wanted to talk about the loss that has had the biggest impact on my life. And that is certainly losing my father, who died nearly 9 years ago now.
Right.
And it's a big story in a way, because the way I handled the grief was not particularly good to start with. So I don't know whether that's of interest.
Yeah, that is of interest. And I think what would be helpful is if you could take us back to when your dad was first diagnosed.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be interesting to hear about what conversations, if any, the family were having at that time around what was happening and what may happen in the future.
So my father was diagnosed around 2006, so about 7 years before he actually died. And he was diagnosed with emphysema, which was completely caused by the fact that he'd smoked since he was 14. He had given up in his late 60s, literally cold turkeyed it, because he'd gone to a doctor for an insurance checkup on a play that I was actually doing with him and my mother at the time. And the doctor had said, if you don't give up smoking, you'll be in a wheelchair in 5 years. And I remember him coming back from that and going, right, I'm never smoking another cigarette. And we, the whole family kind of went, yeah, right, okay. But he never did. But sadly, the damage had been done. And he was diagnosed about 6 years later with emphysema. Now, my parents, my mother is still alive. My parents were from the generation where you just did not talk about things like this, stiff upper lip. They were blitz kids. You just got on with it. So there were no conversations about my father's illness at all. And also my father was so angry with himself for the fact that this was a completely self-inflicted terminal illness. I mean, he was just furious with himself that he had done this to himself. So you didn't really want to talk about it because it just brought up so many awful feelings for him. And so we didn't talk about it. And my family have a very dark, bleak sense of humor. So that's how we dealt with it. And you know, even when he was in the last sort of year, 18 months of his life, he was on oxygen about sort of 12 hours a day. And he'd be sitting on the sofa most of the time with, you know, little things up his nose, and the oxygen machine, very noisy one, going off in the next room. And he'd perhaps go a bit vague, and we'd just go, oh, up the oxygen. You know, I mean, even that was a sort of joke, you know. So there was no preparation, really. And after my father died, I asked my mother if she had had a chat with him, you know, husband and wife. And she said this extraordinary thing. She said, well, one day we came back from a doctor's appointment with his consultant, and it was not good news, you know. And she said, we just stood in the sitting room, and your father said, oh, this is really terrible, isn't it? And we had a hug, and that was it. And I was just like, I had my head in my hands by this point, because I was like, okay, you know, because I was very concerned about my mother as well, in terms of how she was going to navigate the grief, let alone me and my sister. But that was just how they dealt with it. That was their choice, you know.
How was that for you?
Oh, really difficult. I mean, really difficult. And my mother, I mean, well, my mother was already, we didn't realize this at the time, was already in the first stages of Alzheimer's. So, I mean, I don't know whether that was already having an effect on how she was responding to the grief, but she completely shut down. I mean, my parents had been married for 57 years. You know, they met when they were 21 and 22. And, you know, she had lost the person that she'd focused her entire life around. She was a very traditional housewife, mother, although she was also an actress, but she very much put her career third or fourth down the line, you know, after all of us. I think the shock was so immense. And she told me that she probably cried about twice. That was it, you know, and then the disease sort of took hold. But I didn't really collapse until about 2 years later, to be frank. So, you know, grief is a very unpredictable mistress, I think. You absolutely do not know how it's going to treat you and how you're going to treat it. You have no idea until you experience it. That's how I see it. So, yeah, I said to her, please go and talk to someone. Go and talk to a grief counselor, or my parents were not, well, my father was very not religious, but my mother had been quite a sort of regular Protestant churchgoer. And we've got this lovely local vicar near her. And I said, go and talk to Father Kevin. And she would say to me, well, it's not going to bring your father back. And I would say, well, that's not the point. It's about you now. You know, it's about you and your grief. But she never did. And then the Alzheimer's just became the focus. And that was that, really. Yeah.
How many are there of you in the family?
There's me and my older sister.
Okay.
Yeah. And the positive thing that's come out of all of this is that my sister and I have become much, much closer through the last 9 years, because we have had to become the parents to my mother. And that has been the greatest gift of this extremely difficult period, that we have found each other again. I'm not to say that we, you know, weren't speaking or anything. We just, our lives are very different. And, you know, but we have I feel like we've not just rebuilt our connection, but we found a completely new connection through our shared grief and our shared loss, and the fact that we've had to run everything because of my mother's illness. So we've had to take over everything, you know, the financial affairs, the running of my mother's house, the live-in carers, everything. So yeah, that has been the silver lining through it, but very difficult for both of us, because we come from this family where, you know, you just get on with it, and you kind of make a joke about it if you can, you know, and it's a bit indulgent. It's a bit indulgent to get too wrapped up in your own emotions, you know. So yeah, that's the gift, one of the gifts that has come through this.
You mentioned that your dad was at home and he was on oxygen, and in that kind of last year of his life. Can you tell us about your dad's death?
Yes. I think everyone hopes, don't they, for the sort of gathering of the family around the deathbed and the sort of gentle, you know, passage of their loved one onto the other side, you know. And sadly, that was not our experience. And I think that also put me into the most tremendous sort of frozen shock. My father basically died of a massive cardiac arrest at home. And we had always been prepared for a sort of, and actually I'm really pleased he escaped this, because the slow exit through emphysema is horrific. You're basically drowning in your own lungs, you know, it's absolutely horrific. And we were really preparing for that. And we were starting to think, well, we'll have to bring his bed downstairs to the sitting room, because he refused to have a chairlift put in. And we did make a joke, actually, that my father died a week to the day when the Stanner stairlift people came to do an estimate. And I think my father just went, oh, sod this, I'm out. I really do. And he was always known in his career as a comedy actor who was very good at making swift exits, you know, very good at timing. Anyway, so we were not prepared for it. We'd been given a sort of vague timeline that we probably had about another year. And I mean, I can remember it like it was sort of yesterday, but in scraps and pieces. It was a Sunday night. My partner and I were sitting down. We were eating a Chinese takeaway. The phone goes, and my mother said to me, your father's collapsed in the loo. And when I look back on that, and the first thing I said to her was, have you called an ambulance? And she said no. And when I look back on that, I think that was already a sign of her own illness coming through, because of course that would be the first thing anybody would do before calling their child, you know. So I said, put the phone down, call the ambulance. We went over, I live very close to my parents, about a 10-minute drive. I did not have a car at the time, so we had to get a bus, and we had the slowest London bus driver. I mean, most London bus drivers are, you know, the opposite. I was literally sitting on this bus thinking, why have I got the slowest London bus driver in London on this particular night? We got to my parents' house, the ambulance was there, and we rang the doorbell, and a paramedic came to the door and said, do you want to come around the side? Because I don't think you should see your father like this. And I said, no, I'm coming in. He's my father. My partner went round the side just for respect, you know, and went through the back of the house. And my father was lying in the hallway of his house, and they were trying to resuscitate him, basically. That's all I can say. And we were ushered into the kitchen. My mother was standing there in complete shock. My sister was not able to be there that night because she lives in Sussex. And at the time, we hadn't even thought about getting hold of her. And we were also very concerned. We didn't want to kind of call her and go, right, you know, dad's, you know, collapsed on the floor, because I know she would have immediately wanted to get in a car, and we were, you know, it's all that. You make those very quick decisions of like, we wanted her to stay safe. But sometimes I regret that. Sometimes I think she should have been there, you know, although it was so traumatic. So in other ways, I'm glad she wasn't. And then you get into the bleak British humour of, you know, the paramedics say, well, just make some tea. And it's like 10 o'clock at night. And I'm thinking, I don't drink tea after about 5 p.m. I don't know why, but we made tea. We made tea like, you know, like the good British people we are. We made tea and sat around this kitchen table, literally listening to them going clear and all that going on in the hallway. And after about the fourth or fifth time of hearing that noise, I just sat there going, please don't come around, Dad, because I don't know who you're going to be. You probably won't be the person we know, and you'll probably be so, I don't want you to come around. And then a paramedic came in and said, in a beautiful, massive British understatement, we're going to blue light your father to Charing Cross Hospital. And he is very unwell. And I wanted to say to her, he's dead, isn't he? I mean, I really did want to say that. I want to say, I think he's dead. Isn't he dead? I think I saw a dead body when I walked into the hallway. And, you know, but they can't say that, of course, you know, and they're trying to protect you. So my mother went off in the ambulance with my father. I drove a car, don't quite know how I got there. Did the worst bit of parking I've ever done in my life, then ran into Charing Cross. It was by this point about, I have no idea, 11:15, something like that. Couldn't find A&E. Nobody was around. I mean, it was like a sort of Kafkaesque nightmare. And then found A&E, and we were ushered into a family room. And about 20 minutes later, a doctor came and said, you know, he is dead. We can't resuscitate him. And so my mother and I went and said goodbye to him. Oh, I do feel quite emotional, actually. It's been such a long time. But it is very, it was such a traumatic night. And my dear father was lying on a, A&E trolley. And, but it wasn't my father. It's that classic thing, the soul has gone.
Mm-hmm.
And I made myself kiss him on the forehead because I kind of didn't want to. I was kind of quite freaked out. It's my first dead body. And, it's not a particularly pretty sight. And again, not much prepares you for that. And I remember saying to the doctor, please look after him. Please look after him. The idea of sort of leaving that building and leaving my father's body in that building was really hard. I wanted to protect him. I wanted to stay with him, but obviously we couldn't. And then we drove back, and I dropped my partner at our flat, and then I went and stayed the night with my mother. And I actually stayed on and off at my mother's for the next kind of couple of weeks as we organized the funeral, and just so that there was someone with her. And I remember going to bed that night and the absolute realization hitting me that I was never going to see my father again. And I was never going to talk to him again. It's very, very hard, the finality of it. And that realization, you can't pick a phone up. That's it. He's gone. And when we arrived home after leaving him in the hospital, I had this extraordinary kind of almost spiritual enlightenment moment. We walked into his house, the house he had lived in since 1967. So they moved in when I was 4 months old. And I hadn't realized when I'd seen him in A&E that he'd lost a shoe when they'd taken him onto the ambulance. So there was one of his shoes was just left on the floor in the hallway. And the paramedics had pushed everything aside in the hallway to make room to try and resuscitate him. And I walked into the house and I thought, all these possessions, all of this that my father worked so hard for and gave us, and the stability and the beautiful home he worked for, I was like, oh, it's not that it doesn't mean anything. It's like, oh, it's just things. It's just this. It was this extraordinary thing that suddenly, without him there, I just went, oh, so he's free now. He's not bound by all of this. It was just the most amazing experience. This kind of moment of understanding that things are, well, they are important, of course. A home, a roof, being able to feed oneself, all of those things, of course, are vital for one's quality of life and health. But possessions, I don't know, I have a very different feeling about them now. I declutter almost annually, and I'm not as sentimental about things now, because I just had this feeling that my father was, he was off. He didn't need any of these things.
Mm. And they didn't mean anything without him.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, the house still means a huge amount. My mother still lives there, although we are moving her into a care home this year because her needs have become too much for live-in carers to sustain. But, she wanted to live there as long as possible. So, that house has seen the entire family life of the Briers family, from the late 60s. And that's no small thing. But yeah, they meant less because my father wasn't there. Yeah. So that was, and it's that interesting thing, isn't it? In the press, because he was a well-known figure, of course, they do that thing of, Richard Briers passed away peacefully at home. Well, I hope it was peaceful for him. I hope it was, what I hope is that he literally just went. But it was not a peaceful experience. It was not that sort of, slow, saying everything you mean to say, farewell. It was it was pretty brutal. And I think perhaps the experience of the death, the type of death a loved one has, perhaps is then reflected on the process of grief. You know, I have a feeling if it had been a slower, gentler passing away by a bedside, my grief wouldn't have kind of just frozen in aspic, which it did for a couple of years.
For 2 years, you said it wasn't until 2 years later. Can you tell us about that, Lucy?
Well, you know, if you put this into a film, people would think it was a bit over the top, but this is absolute gospel truth. I am next of kin to my aunt, my father's sister. She has no children, and she has very, very numerous health issues. And I ended up being in an ambulance with her 2 years later, going to Charing Cross Hospital, to the A&E department. Got into the department, she's being dealt with, and I look up at the number of the cubicle, and it's the same cubicle where my father died. And that's when it all went. Yeah, that's when it all just fell apart. And I started shaking. I started and I'd been to a grief counselor, you know, I'd done 6 sessions with a grief counselor, and I cried a lot, and I'd done all of that. That was about a year before. And a typical, you know, member of my family, I'd gone, well, that's done. I mean, I'm absolutely, that's marvelous. Well, that's sorted. There we go. You know, and but I started to shake, and I thought, right, well, I can't do this in front of my aunt. She's got her own problems to deal with. So again, classic British moment, I said, I'm just going to the bathroom. And I then went and sort of proceeded to have a sort of what I can only describe as kind of nervous collapse in a disabled loo, shaking, crying, almost like I was in pain, you know. And again, very British, after 5 minutes, went, right, I've got to pull myself together, you know, so sort of like wash my face and went back to the cubicle, by which point my aunt was stabilized. And, you know, she's very used to these hospital visits. So she said, look, they're going to take me in for a few days. Can you go and get a few things from my house and blah, blah, blah. So I was very glad I was able to leave. But 24 hours later, I was sitting on my sofa watching some, you know, completely sort of benign television program, and I literally had an out-of-body experience. I literally felt like I was watching myself crumbling like a statue, like cracking, falling apart. And I thought, right, okay, come on, you can't hide this anymore, you can't run from this anymore. So I texted a friend of ours who's a psychotherapist, and I said, can you recommend someone? I need some help. And I'm very fortunate that he put me in touch with an amazing psychotherapist, and through the work I did with her, not only actually about the grief, but kind of it then kind of snowballed into all sorts of other things and areas of my life. She has changed my life. I mean, my life is a very, very different landscape now. But yeah, that sort of saved me. That saved my sanity and allowed me the time to work through losing a person who had been so incredibly important to me in so many different ways, and so beloved, you know. And yeah, it's allowed me that journey, which I'm very, very lucky to have gone through.
I think that's really important what you just touched on there when you described how in your therapy, then it wasn't just about the grief, but actually it was about, you know, it spanned kind of all areas of your life. And I think, you know, what lots of people don't often realize is that grief does impact on everything, or can impact
Absolutely.
on everything.
Absolutely. Funnily enough, I am reading H is for Hawk, you know, by Helen Macdonald, which is a book about grief and losing a father, you know, as well as falconry. And it's quite an extraordinary book. And I'm very near the end of it now. And she talks about the fact that your world is literally, and well, oh gosh, no, I was figuratively never the same again. Well, no, and literally. Once you lose somebody who is that close to you. So you have to understand that and adapt to that, and learn how to move forward through that new landscape, and try not to hold on too much to the old landscape. And that has been my biggest sort of journey of allowing myself to let go of things, you know, because my father was a public figure, and some people would have called him a national treasure. I mean, we used to take the mick out of him sometimes and go, come on, love, you know, you're a national treasure. The other aspect of the grieving, which I think was another reason why it went on hold, was because we were also dealing with the loss in the general public. I mean, which was astoundingly affectionate and, to begin with, of great comfort. I mean, in the first week, my mother received something like 750 letters and cards,
Wow.
you know, about my father, about things my father had done for people that we had no idea about, you know. And of course, that was incredibly comforting and almost like a sort of little life raft for us.
Mm-hmm.
But after a while, you start to go, now, hold on a minute. Am I sort of processing my grief through this kind of prism of the public grief? I need to be grieving my father. I don't need to be grieving, you know, Tom Good from The Good Life, you know. And I remember I sort of slightly snapped a couple of weeks in, because I mean, the cards and letters just kept on coming and kept on coming. And a letter came through, and I mean, we didn't reply to any of them, you know, I mean, but we kept many of them. But there was one letter, and it came from somebody I think my father had worked with briefly. And it was a very well-intentioned letter, and it was a very dear letter about my father. There was this one thing where this person said, "The day I heard your father had died, I cried all afternoon." And I just suddenly thought, seriously? Really? And I got really cross, because I was like, I'm his daughter, and I think I've cried like for 3 minutes, you know. This was like 3-4 weeks after he died. And I thought, how can you, somebody who barely knew this man, say you cried all afternoon? And I suddenly got really cross, and I thought, right, I'm not going to read any more of these letters, even though we were, as I say, I don't mean that to sound cruel or dismissive, but it was of no help anymore for me personally. I think my mother actually got a lot of comfort from them, and kept them in box files, and they're still in her house, you know. But I just went, I can't do that. I can't do it anymore, because I kind of felt like my grief was being overwhelmed by a sort of public grief, which was ultimately, of course, not as deeply felt as mine, you know. And again, I don't mean that to sound in any way unpleasant, but it was a very unexpected part of my grieving process. And you know, a lot of people, my father stood or represented for a lot of people their childhoods, because of Rhubarb and Custard and The Good Life and all these things. So it was a general mourning for people's own childhoods and innocence and all that sort of stuff. But I had to remove myself from that after a while, because I had to remember that he was my father. You know, it sounds really bizarre, but yeah.
No, it doesn't at all.
Yeah.
You're talking about, what about my grief?
Yeah.
You know, what about my experience? How do I begin to even navigate it or think about it when, you know, so many others are joining in with this?
Yes, and wonderful, and, you know, so heartfelt and so genuine. And meaning to be supportive. But yeah, after a while, it just, for me personally, it just wasn't anymore. It just was something I had to shut out, you know, and focus in on the man we had lost, you know, the husband my mother had lost, and the father my sister and I had lost. Yeah, and that takes some doing, you know.
Some of life's questions are harder than others. If you or a loved one are facing end of life or bereavement, Marie Curie is here to listen and help. Call our free support line on 0800 090 2309 or start a web chat by visiting mariecurie.org.uk/support.
You described before, I'm going to talk about navigating again, you described how people can reach a point in grief where they've got to navigate the new world that doesn't have that person in it anymore as a physical being. And so you talked about therapy being helpful. It sounds like also reading books about grief is helpful. What else has helped you?
Well, do you know, funnily enough, this is the first book about grief I've read.
Okay.
Yeah. I didn't want to read about grief, because I was like, yeah, I'm in it. I need to read about it. It's so funny. It's like I don't read a lot of female authors, because I'm like, I'm living the female experience. I want to read about the male experience. But yeah, I think the thing that helped me enormously, and has always helped me, to be frank, is my work. Because I'm an actor, to be able to escape into being another person, it's just such a relief sometimes, if your life is tough. I mean, I went through a very difficult divorce about, 16 years ago, 16 years ago, which is another process of grieving and mourning, and another process of going, oh, the landscape I was walking is not the landscape I thought I was walking, you know, all of that goes on. And if I hadn't worked, oh my goodness. So I didn't work after my father's death. I didn't work for about 6 months because I just said to my agent, I can't do this. I can't work. And I did lots of voiceovers, thank God. I always do. So that's, you know, that made the bills get paid. And then I got a job with the Royal Shakespeare Company, a company I've never worked for before. And I got into the company to do Hilary Mantel's, you know, adaptations of Hilary Mantel's amazing novels, Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies. And I was playing Catherine of Aragon and Lady Rochford. Lady Rochford is a fabulous, sort of wonderful, mad lady who is Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law. So that was so much fun to play because I could just be completely off the wall and I had so much fun playing that. Catherine of Aragon, who was quite a lady, my God. This struck me literally this week. She died of a broken heart. You know, she died at the age of 52. I think it was 51, 52. And they did a post-mortem, which is kind of weird. I didn't quite understand why they did that, but anyway, they did. And she had, everything was completely healthy apart from this black tumor around her heart. I mean, come on. I mean, that's just kind of Shakespearean in itself, isn't it? And I think that was extraordinary for me to play. And this was before I'd had my collapse with my aunt in Charing Cross. So this was the time when I was still not really facing up to my grief. But to play someone who is so utterly like bitter and angry and morally so in the right, actually, and fights for her status and for people to still respect her. I think I channeled an awful lot of my unbeknownst to me really into that woman, and it was very cathartic to go on stage and play her and have that sort of be able to be angry and sort of full of darkness. It was so. I think my work is the thing that got me through that, and I mean I played that part for 2 years because we did it at Stratford-upon-Avon, then we did it in the West End, and then we went to New York. So I love that woman. I have a real, I feel like I almost know her. Oh, I do. I feel like I know her because if you inhabit a person from history for that amount of time, I think you kind of do. I think you know that person. So yeah.
That's so interesting. I've never heard an actor talking about, you know, kind of linking their work to their experience of grief, and it makes complete sense. And it's really interesting. I just want to go back, Lucy, to at the beginning you said that there were 3 other people who you might want to talk about today.
Yes.
Are you okay to share those stories?
Yes, absolutely. The first friend I lost after my father's death was in the same year, actually on my birthday. I was like, oh, come on. She was very elderly and we knew she was dying. She had pancreatic cancer, but she was a real life mentor for me. I have trained as an energy healer in my time, and she was somebody who led me very much through that process, and she was a healer. She was a co-founder of the Bristol Cancer Help Centre, now known as the Penny Bronze Centre in Bristol, Pat Pilkington. She was the most extraordinary woman. And I met her many, many, many years ago when I myself was dealing with a very rare non-cancerous tumour in my early 20s. And her husband did healing work on me, and to extraordinary effect. So Pat and her husband Christopher were people who were very important to me in my life. And Christopher died some years before, and I used to go and stay with Pat in Bristol, and we'd have these wonderful weekends together, and we'd do healing sessions, and we'd talk. I mean, oh my God, she was just like a sort of, well, she was like a spiritual mentor. So to lose her in the same year as losing my dad, who was also a real life guide for me, I did feel very orphaned in the widest sense of the word. And especially because my mother was already starting to not be quite my mother. So these kind of guiding, these anchors were just disappearing all over the place. So that was very hard, and although expected. And then the next year, I lost a friend of mine, an actress, who totally unexpectedly she died of an asthma attack. And I got the news while doing a matinee of Wolf Hall, dressed as Catherine of Aragon, actually. I was in my dressing room, the phone went, her name came up on my mobile. She and I met on one of our first jobs, so we'd known each other, I'm just trying to think, 20 odd years. And we had these silly characters we used to do to each other. We used to do these silly old women who talk like that. And I picked up the phone and went, "Hello, darling." And it was like one of her best friends saying, "Hi, Lucy." And I just thought, oh my God, what is going on? And I remember, so I'm in kind of massive, heavy 16th century costume with a very tight corset, and I just couldn't breathe. I was literally going, like this. And, the actress I was sharing a dressing with was going, "Okay, well, oh my God," and I was very fortunate that the next scene I was supposed to be on, I didn't say anything. So the stage manager said, "You're not going on." But I did have to go on like 5-6 minutes later. I mean, so that was horrendous.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last friend I lost, it was about, I kind of have lost track of time now, probably 2016, maybe even 2017, was a friend of mine I'd known since we were 15, and we did youth theatre together, and she died of blood cancer. And I had gone to see her in hospital about a week before she died. And she was somebody, again, who never, ever communicated to her friends how ill she was. That's not how she dealt with it. But when I went to see her, I remember, I was literally in full PPE, it's pre-COVID, because she was going through her treatment, and I had to sit way away from her. But I remember thinking to myself, I think she's dying. I just remember she got out of her bed to go to the bathroom, and I looked at her shin muscles, and I thought, I think she's dying, and she died about 6 days later. And she was somebody who had been, again, a constant in my life. We wrote comedy together. We were so different in every possible way. We were like total polar opposites, which was what was so great about our friendship. So yeah, within 3-4 years, I'd lost my father and 3 people who had meant a lot to me. And it did feel like I was just being punched. I just remember thinking, I don't know how I can deal with, I don't know how I can keep dealing with this. And one of the big things that it has massively shifted in me, and which I really work hard to fight against, is the fact that I catastrophize. So I do, if I say goodbye to my partner, or I say goodbye to my stepdaughter, or I say goodbye to a friend, I have this appalling feeling that I'll never see them again. And I still have that. And I think something terrible is going to happen. Or, if if I'm at the top of the house and I call down to my partner, and he is actually slightly deaf in his left ear, so most of the time he doesn't hear me. It might be selective as well, but I will call down to him. And if he doesn't respond, I swear to you, 70% of the time, I think, oh, he's had a heart attack. Oh, he's dead. I still think that. So that's something, I have to keep working on, because, you can't live your life like that. You can't. But I think it's that thing of my father died so suddenly, my friend died so suddenly of an asthma attack. These people are just snatched. They're just snatched away from you. And, these people that you literally spoke to a week before, or in my case, my father 2 days before, and as it's so absolute. The absence is immediate and absolute, and so there was a huge level of trauma has happened. But I think so many people have experienced that in the last couple of years, especially because of COVID, and that horrific thing of not being able to go and say goodbye to your loved one in a hospital. I can't, at the beginning of COVID, my mother's so damaged now by Alzheimer's, and my worst nightmare was the idea of her ending up in a hospital, like one of those massive Nightingale hospitals. This was at the time when, we had no idea where the pandemic was going to go. And I just had this vision of her alone, oh my God. I think a lot of people have been so traumatized and not been able to witness in a proper way the passing of their loved ones. And I think that's, in my experience, that seems to be when grief and the process of grief is a long one. I think if you can't witness it, or the witnessing of it is very scarring, I think that's a very hard process. I'm
going to change tack slightly, Lucy.
Yes.
I want to ask if you ever think about your own death.
I do. I'm quite morbid. I keep a regular update of things I want read and played at my funeral. But I think that's just my control freak side. But I've experienced illness in my life. So I am not somebody who has not faced the idea of my mortality. I had a very rare, as I said earlier, tumor in my 20s, and I had 6 operations over 9 months when I was like 21, 22. And at 21, 22, you kind of think you're going to live forever. You're like, yay, great, my God, I'm immortal. And then this happens and you go, oh, what? Wow. So that was quite an early initiation into things aren't quite as simple as they may seem, and one's health is not as robust as one may hope it will be. And then about 11, 12 years ago, I was diagnosed with a very rare, like my tumor. I mean, my loved ones always roll their eyes if I, as I come back from the doctor and go, yes, it's another rare thing, but I have a rare blood disorder. There's about 1,000 of us in this country that have it. There's about 1 million people across the planet that have it. No one knows where it comes from. It's a gene switch. It's, there we go. The research on it is moving forward, but I am very lucky with it. I am asymptomatic like 99% of the time. Some people are very, very badly affected by it. And again, touching wood, I don't take any drugs or treatment for it apart from a blood thinner. But when I was told I had it, I was at that point under the care, I'll put that in speech marks, of a very what's the word? Kind of consultant who has that kind of God complex little bit. And, I think a lot of consultants and a lot of brilliant doctors and surgeons almost have to have that in order to be able to go, I'm going to do a heart transplant today. You kind of have to have that level of sort of like arrogance. But this person was particularly kind of judgmental and unpleasant in terms of sort of telling me the diagnosis, kind of saying, you've got this, there's nothing we can do about it. We don't know how to treat it. I mean, they do know how to treat it, but they don't know how to cure it. And there you go. And I said, oh, well, okay, well, I'll look into some complementary treatments as well. And this person just laughed in my face and then handed me a leaflet about this blood disorder and said, oh, just read that at home. And I was sort of sent out, it's kind of going, oh my God. Anyway, I foolishly read the leaflet the next day on my own. And at the end of probably every other paragraph, it said, and you can die. It just kept saying it. And you can die. As if it was like, and, you can go for a walk and you can die. And by the end of it, I was just, I was literally having a panic attack almost. I mean, it was, the fear of death was enormous, and I mean, I made a formal complaint about the wording of the leaflet and it has been reworded.
Good. And I think for the person themselves, but also who else is going to pick that up? Who else is at home? Who else is going to read it?
Yes, if I'd had children, or absolutely, so anyway, I'm very fortunate. I made a very conscious effort, and I'm able to because I am asymptomatic. I live alongside this disorder. COVID was a huge shock to me because I was labeled clinically vulnerable. And for someone who goes, yeah, I've got this disorder, it's fine, it's just off over there, it's not a problem, absolutely fine. And then to get a black and white letter going, and you are in the clinically vulnerable, I was like, oh God, okay. So I did spend most of 2020 not going outside. I mean, I will absolutely admit to that. And my partner was amazing and did all the shopping and did all of that because I was like, and there would have been, if I'd got it really badly before the vaccinations, there would have been pretty high odds that I would have been hospitalized and maybe worse. So, I think I have thought about my death quite a lot. And having just had what I presume was Omicron, having been triple vaxxed and having a mild bout, oh my God, the level of relief that you go, this thing that I have feared for 2 years that could lead to my demise, I've now kind of experienced, So yeah, I do think about my death. I don't want to go yet. Let's put it like that. I'm 54. I have a lot more to do. I'm still frightened of death. There's no doubt about that. But I have a sort of weird spiritual feeling that we get recycled. So I think we come back. I think I feel like I've been here many times, which means I'm not learning what I should be learning. But I do have this very, very, very clear memory of when I was about 6 or 7, lying in bed and saying out loud to myself, this time I'm Lucy Briers. I just remember just going, okay, this is who I am this time. I just had this absolute kind of undiluted certainty that this was who I was this time. So I've never forgotten that. So yeah, it's not, I don't have a sort of, we all sit on clouds playing harps view of what might be after, but I certainly feel there is an energy that continues. And that does bring me comfort. I know that sounds all a bit wishy-washy and but it brings me comfort, and it makes me feel that there is some purpose to what we do here. And it gives me a sort of guide to how we behave and how we are as human beings, and how we operate and should operate and all of that. So yeah, I'm scared of it. Just in terms of how those final moments might be for me. But I know this sounds really bizarre. I'm also like, there's also a sort of like, it'd be quite exciting to know what happens to me next time. I have no idea. God knows. Well, God doesn't know. I don't know. I don't. Oh, it's terrible. I'm the kind of person that people who have a real firm belief just kind of go, oh, for God's sake, make your mind up, because I literally, it's like I have a kind of smorgasbord approach to faith, where I go, I like that one. And, oh, that's nice. When that I'm afraid I don't adhere to like an organized religion, because I worry about the fact that, that kind of, by following one faith, you sort of block everything else out, and I think there's so much more to this world than we have any idea about.
And you've talked quite a bit about spirituality, and I think that that makes sense. You choose the bits that mean something to you, and also help and support you as well.
Yes.
I've got a couple of more questions just before we finish off today, Lucy, and one is, how would you like to be remembered when you die?
I think someone who was a really good friend. And I don't have children. I have a stepdaughter. I have 6 godchildren. I love being with the generations below. I would like to be remembered as someone who, passes on any nuggets of wisdom I might have picked up, and could kind of help the generation coming up. A good friend, someone who was there for people and who loved the people around them. I think that's how I'd like to be remembered, as someone who was, a good egg. Really.
Thank you. And my last question is, what's it meant for you today to come on the Marie Curie couch and have this conversation?
Oh, it's been really amazing, actually, because I lost my father really quite a long time ago now. You do get on with one's life. You get on with it, and you do, and you do learn to walk through that landscape, the new landscape, without that person, as you were saying, without those people. But it literally has given me a chance to, in a way, see where I am with all of this, actually. And that's good. And I was quite surprised how emotional I got talking to you about the night my father died. But actually, that's a good thing, that those emotions are there, and I can experience them and sit with them and think about them and think about the friends I've lost. And yeah, it's a good thing to talk. I think that is so important, the talking cure. It's so important. And I do we're coming right round to the beginning again, I do feel strongly that if my parents had been able to talk to each other about my father's imminent death, my mother would have been better prepared. Despite her illness, she would have been better prepared. And I think her grief brought on her illness quicker. It sort of sped it through because she wasn't able to process, and she hadn't spoken about it to my dad or to us. So yes, it's meant a lot to be able to, hopefully share and hopefully reach out to other people who are experiencing things and hopefully help other people,
Lucy Briers, thank you for joining me on the Marie Curie couch. Thank you for your open and honest conversation. And it really has been a joy to meet you.
And you, thank you so much. And thank you for making it a very comforting and supporting environment. Thank you very much.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help, from planning ahead to coping with bereavement. You can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 080 2309 or search Marie Curie online. The podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Sound and Vision. The music featured is Time Lapse by Pan Oceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.